This we won't see again. With no military role and no HRH, Prince Andrew is now out of the firm. One day after a New York judge told Prince Andrew he could not block that sex abuse case, the sudden and humiliating announcement that the Duke of York is no longer grand. Two royal correspondents read the runes for us. Also tonight...
Douglas Ross has always been quite a lightweight figure.
Oof! How did that description of the Scottish Conservative leader go down on the backbenches?
I think it's deeply insulting. I think he's also wrong, fundamentally, and I think he should have kept his trap shut.
And it's the phrase du jour, living with COVID. But what exactly does it mean?
It doesn't mean that we just give up and just accept the high rates that we're seeing now and mortality. It's about learning to adapt.
Good evening. With the Duke of York facing a civil trial in an American court, the palace has apparently bowed to the inevitable. Prince Andrew will no longer use his HRH title, and his military titles and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen. It's been 2 years since the Prince stepped back from royal duties. 2 long years for the likes of the Grenadier Guards, who've been unable to replace the Prince as ceremonial colonel of the regiment, despite him being accused of sexual assault by Virginia Giuffre, a charge he vehemently denies. So who's behind today's decision? And in this Platinum Jubilee year, will it ensure Prince Andrew's problems remain his alone? Here's our UK editor, Seema Katecha.
A proud military man who served with distinction, now humiliated. Prince Andrew cast out from the military family, a central plank of his identity. As head of the armed forces and the woman in charge of making honorary military appointments, the Queen has stripped her second son of his military titles and royal patronages. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said, "With the Queen's approval and agreement, the Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen. The Duke of York will continue not to undertake any public duties and is defending this case as a private citizen." Prince Andrew used to be a helicopter pilot in the Royal Navy. He served in the Falklands War, where he claimed to have lost his ability to sweat. After that, he was awarded 8 British military titles, including Colonel of the Grenadier Guards, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army. It was this rank that meant he was able to participate in the Trooping the Colour parade, although he's not been involved since 2019. This all stems from a judge's decision to allow a civil lawsuit to go ahead, involving claims from Virginia Giuffre that she was sexually assaulted by the Prince when she was 17, something he vehemently denies.
The royal family and the armed forces have unique ties stretching back centuries, so the loss of military titles is a devastating blow to the Prince, and one that was being called for by many service personnel.
Today, more than 150 past and present members of the British military wrote to the Queen asking her to take immediate steps in removing his titles. They said, "We understand that he is your son, but we write to you in your capacity as head of state and as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy and Air Force. These steps could have been taken at any time in the past 11 years. Please do not leave it any longer." All his roles have been returned to the monarch and will be redistributed to other members of the family. He will no longer use his HRH title. Prince Andrew's friends expect him to continue to fight to clear his name, but there is no taking away how bruising this moment is for him. His reputation already in tatters, and now no way back to the public life he knew as His Royal Highness, the Duke of York.
Well, joining me now is Roya Nika, royal editor of the Sunday Times, and Peter Hunt, former BBC royal correspondent. And Peter, This statement from Buckingham Palace, does that mean that the decision was made by the Queen alone, the fact that it came from Buckingham Palace?
I think we can be pretty confident it didn't come just from her. It was in her name. But she, when dealing with problems in her family, and they've had plenty during her reign, she tends to be quite ostrich-like. So she will have only done this if she'd had her resolve stiffened by Prince Charles and Prince William. Those two are due to inherit the throne, and they didn't want to inherit a throne that received further damage through the actions of Prince Andrew. And
Roya, I mean, this was obviously precipitated by the judge, what the judge said yesterday, but why now? I mean, it does feel like it could have happened before now, quite a long time ago, in fact.
I think that there has been pressure building on the Duke of York for many months. I mean, you know, we've been reporting in the Sunday Times for over a year that senior members of the royal family, including the Prince of Wales, Duke of Cambridge, saw no return for the Duke of York back to public duties ever. That being the case, you're absolutely right, why not sooner? But I think what we've had in the last sort of few weeks is we've had the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, we've had a conviction there, and pressure was building on Prince Andrew. And I think, you know, that letter from all those military veterans setting out their case, and that has come after weeks of other military sources coming out and saying, you know, this is not tenable. It was just too much. And I think we are now into a Jubilee year. You know, we are in the first few weeks of a Jubilee year. The Queen and other senior royals would have wanted a line to be drawn under this, if at all possible, before we start to celebrate the Queen's 70 years on the throne. So it had to happen sooner or later.
And Peter, is that your reading of it? What do you think they hope to achieve by doing this? Draw a line under it, move on? That's
their hope. I mean, it's a brutal defenestration. This is what a sacking looks like if you're ninth in line to the throne. He's still a prince, he's still a duke, but he's a non-royal royal. And in essence, you know, if you strip away what the royal family is about, it's about a symbol of national unity. And it's what's not helpful is having someone linked to it, quite closely linked to it, who had as friends two convicted criminals. So I think what it shows is that even though they are a family, they are also an institution. And when push comes to shove and when they're under threat, the sort of dynastic need to survive trumps flesh and blood.
And would you say, Roya, would you say that this means we can expect never to see Prince Andrew in public again?
No, I don't think so. I think we will definitely never see him again in a formal, official capacity. But in terms of, you know, family engagements, family events, you know, he is still the Queen's son. I think we will still see him at some select family moments. But we will never, ever see him on the world stage, you know, in the way that he's been used to for the last 40 years in an official role. And that will hurt the Duke of York. But this has been a long time coming. You know, the Queen has read the room finally, but many people will feel that, you know, she has delayed this decision at quite a cost to the institution.
And since this decision was made, I mean, everyone's been saying there's no way back from it. You know, he will never be HRH again. Is that your reading of it, that he couldn't get it back?
I think it's highly unlikely to get it back.
He is still an HRH. In the same way that Prince Harry is still an HRH, Andrew is still an HRH, but he will no longer use it in an official capacity ever again. It's my understanding that that's final.
And Peter, do you think that means, you know, he won't be able to be allowed to use it again ever?
Yes, precisely. And it will be the thing that hurts him most. You know, he was born a royal, he was born HRH, he's used it for 61 years.
It means something to him.
It means massively something to him. You and I are not burdened with such a thing, but those who are burdened with it tend to resent it when they lose it.
And yesterday on the programme, Virginia Giuffre's lawyer said she won't settle out of court. Roya, is it your expectation we will see Prince Andrew in court then?
Look, I know sources close to Andrew are saying, you know, today that he will continue to fight all the way. But I think, I don't think we'll ever see him in a courtroom in America. I think Prince Andrew will very likely look to try and settle this. You know, the Queen has tried to draw a line under it today. But if we are still looking at a potential trial in the autumn, and this is hanging over the institution and the rest of the family for the rest of the year, nobody wants that. So I would be very surprised if Prince Andrew doesn't pursue a settlement. The big question is, will Virginia Giuffre accept that now? And from what David Boyce was telling you last night, perhaps not. It sounds like she's quite keen for her day in court, or something more than just a financial settlement from Andrew, some sort of admission.
We will see. Roya Nicker, Peter Hunt, thank you so much for coming in. Thank you. Now, of course, there is another high-profile figure who's facing an uncertain future right now, the Prime Minister, who yesterday apologised in Parliament for attending a bring-your-own-bottle event in the Downing Street Garden in the first lockdown in 2020, which he claims was not a party. His admission that he was there led the leader of the Scottish Conservatives to call for his resignation. And later, on this programme last night, the leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, brushed that off, calling Douglas Ross a lightweight figure. Is this a sign of a damaging split in the Conservative and Unionist Party, with England's Tories now at odds with their Scottish counterparts, or an attempt to shift the focus from our Prime Minister? Our political editor, Nick Watt, is here. And Nick, I think there is some breaking news about more parties.
That's right, Katie, and breaking news which contrasts those parties in Downing Street with the punctilious approach of the Queen to the lockdown rules. So hopefully we can look at the front page of the Daily Telegraph tomorrow. They've got the story. And if we look towards the bottom of front page, we should see a headline which says, "Parties held at number 10 as Her Majesty mourned." And this says that there was what was described as quite a boozy, drunken party in Downing Street on the night before the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh. So you can imagine the scene at St George's Chapel in Windsor. The late Duke's coffin is lying in rest as there's this leaving do described as music in the basement. One number 10 official was acting as a DJ, and this party, according to the Daily Telegraph, went on until the early hours. And of course, at that point back in April, England was in step 2 of lockdown, and everybody can remember that image, very sad image of the Queen. There she is alone in St George's Chapel, the funeral of her husband, totally alone, because Her Majesty was observing those lockdown rules, which for England at the time banned indoor mixing. And for her late husband, there was a book of condolence, but to respect those rules, it was online. Now, Downing Street haven't commented, but when we do go to them about these parties, they always say that the veteran Whitehall official, Sue Gray, is examining these parties, and if new details emerge, she's free to look into those.
But what a week it has been already. I mean, what day are we on? Thursday? It's been quite a week. You know, how is Boris Johnson standing right now in his party in Perth or Field?
He is still standing, but his authority and his position is weakening. And there's some more breaking news tonight, which is the Sutton Coldfield Conservative Constituency Association. This is one of the largest true blue seats in the West Midlands. They have voted unanimously to say no confidence in the leadership of their party by Boris Johnson. This story was broken by Jonathan Walker, who is the political editor of the Birmingham Post and Mail. Now, this seat is held by Andrew Mitchell. Andrew Mitchell is a big supporter, was a big supporter of Boris Johnson. He is said to be surprised by the strength of feeling, and I understand that Andrew Mitchell is taking soundings after he has heard this result. I think his view is that he wants to wait for that report by Sue Gray to decide what he may do. But the point is, we were talking about how the red wall Conservative MPs, those are in former Labour seats, were getting worried. This seat is the opposite of red wall. It is absolutely true blue, and it's a unanimous vote against Boris Johnson's leadership. So look, it's a pretty febrile atmosphere at the moment, and interestingly, it took quite a turn last night in this studio when Jacob Rees-Mogg seemed to demean the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, and that has raised questions about that debate over the future of the Union. A mission at the heart of the Conservative and Unionist Party down the centuries, preserving the Union. Thatcher, Major, Cameron, May. Vastly different prime ministers, but with one goal in common: fighting for the Union, though often in controversial ways. And now Boris Johnson, an absentee prime minister in Scotland, who didn't cross the border for last year's Holyrood election. And a chief ally keen to remind the leader of the Scottish Conservatives just who is top dog.
Douglas Ross has always been quite a lightweight figure, so I don't think that
Remarks last night which did not go down well with Conservatives at Holyrood.
Good morning. Jacob Rees-Mogg, as anyone, is entitled to their opinions. I don't have to agree with them.
Leader of the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Back in his place today, the Leader of the Commons doubled down whilst insisting he too is a unionist.
The honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, has office within the Conservative Party, and it seems to me that people who hold office ought to support the leader of the party. That is the honourable and proper thing to do. But the United Kingdom is something that we can celebrate and debate in this chamber on a daily basis. It is the foundation, the cornerstone of the success of the nation as a whole.
Central Lobby, the heart of the Union Parliament, symbolised by the patron saints from all four corners of the original United Kingdom. And a short distance from here, earlier today, Jacob Rees-Mogg once again waded into the highly sensitive debate on the future of that union. Demeaning the man trying to save the UK undermines the UK, a senior Tory told me. Jacob should never have spoken out like that, a Scottish Tory grandee said, before adding, it did all really have the feel of a playground spat. But some Tories were highly critical of Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I think it's incredibly rude. I mean, there's plenty of Tory MPs who perhaps have views about Jacob they're not particularly complimentary, but we keep them to ourselves. So I think it's deeply insulting. I think he's also wrong, fundamentally, and I think he should have kept his trap shut. We have a cabinet which is committed to preserving the union, because that's, as I say, in the interest of all of us who live in these islands, but actually just giving an open goal to nationalists, and that's completely and utterly self-defeating. And as I say, Jacob should apologise.
A former Conservative MSP believes the remarks did cause harm.
I mean, the most charitable interpretation one could give to Jacob's remarks are that he was careless yesterday evening, but perhaps it wasn't just carelessness. Perhaps it was something a bit more unpleasant even than that. I mean, one could go so far as to say it was an act of almost self-sabotage or political vandalism. However you describe it, though, it is incredibly unhelpful to have senior members of Boris Johnson's government going out of their way to undermine the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, who is the leader, to all intents and purposes, of the unionist cause north of the border.
The SNP see a Tory own goal.
I think he's probably offended the vast majority of Scottish Conservatives with that comment. He also said that Douglas Ross had never supported Boris Johnson, whereas actually Douglas was very open about supporting him for the leadership and having voted for him. So I would say he's just shot himself in the foot from the point of view of Conservative supporters in Scotland.
The centre of political gravity in Scotland, a parliament providing authority to nationalists who want to end the union and to unionists to challenge their Prime Minister.
Well, there's one name that's been repeated over and over in the last couple of days. Wait for Sue Gray's report has been the cry from Conservatives backing the Prime Minister, even the Metropolitan Police. This, as Labour's deputy leader has said, the inquiry by the civil servant tasked with investigating those alleged parties could leave the Prime Minister acting as judge and jury over his own conduct, even though, as she put it, he is also the man in the dock. So who is Sue Gray, and can we really expect her report to be all it's billed? Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall.
For a week or so now, British politics has been reduced to 2 words.
Sue Gray.
Sue Gray.
Sue Gray. Sue Gray.
Sue Gray.
Sue Gray.
Wasn't Sue Gray? Sue Gray.
The woman on everyone's lips, of unimpeachable integrity, we're told, in whose hands the Prime Minister's fate apparently rests. But is that fair? Who is she? And what of her much vaunted report can we expect?
Well, she's a very long-standing, long-serving civil servant who's worked her way up through the ranks through a variety of jobs. She sort of came to public notice, if you like, doing this propriety and ethics job in the Cabinet Office for successive Cabinet Secretaries for Gus O'Donnell and Jeremy Hayward, successive Prime Ministers. And really what she did there was, when difficulties arose about, people's behaviour, breaching the rules, she would be the person to investigate. She'd also be the sort of person that if you were appointed as a minister, she'd be the person that would have a chat with you about any possible conflicts of interest.
Sue Gray is known as a Whitehall enforcer, someone to whom Prime Ministers can turn to sort knotty problems.
I'm Sue Gray, I'm Head of Propriety and Ethics in the Cabinet Office.
It was this job, overseeing ethics across government, for which she is best known. Oliver Letwin once said, our great United Kingdom is actually entirely run by a lady called Sue Gray, the head of ethics or something at the Cabinet Office. Unless she agrees, things just don't happen.
And public appointments.
But we shouldn't forget the genesis of this inquiry. Initially, it was supposed to investigate allegations of a party attended by civil servants and some political aides. That was easy for a civil servant to look into and potentially discipline, so the PM asked the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case. Until it transpired, Case attended one of the parties.
Thank you. I mean, part of
So in stepped Sue Gray. But then we learned the PM was at one as well. So suddenly you have a civil servant in a very uncomfortable position over the Prime Minister they serve. Her account is likely to be strictly factual, perhaps focused on the civil servants, how these events came to be organised, rather than passing judgment on those who attended. That could be very bad news for Martin Reynolds, the PM's principal private secretary, who sent the now infamous Bring Your Own Booze email. She may be an unimpeachable figure of Whitehall, but she is still of Whitehall and placed in an impossible position by the system she serves.
One of the big problems in this is, as I say, it's difficult for Sue Gray to investigate the Prime Minister. And there's a big question in this about whether he misled Parliament in the various defences that he's been given since these stories first broke. And that's not her place to do. That's the job of Lord Geidt. But of course, he can't investigate that unless the Prime Minister gives him permission, which is an extraordinary situation to be in. So you might see further investigations into that, depending on what Sue Gray has to say.
This inquiry will not be independent. Sue Gray may be independently minded, she may be impartial, but she won't be independent. Ultimately, she is a civil servant. She works for the government. Her two bosses, the Cabinet Secretary and the Prime Minister, are both said to have attended one or other of these alleged parties at some point. Moreover, as a civil servant, it is written into her DNA to try and help and serve the government of the day, not to damn them. But perhaps the bigger question here is, with a government where standard stories seem so often to be in the news, can it be right or fair or the best system that the civil service is used as judge and jury and sometimes as human shield for that government? Or rather, is it that the common thread that unites all of those stories is that the standard system itself is in need of reform? The PM, Number 10, the Met, the Cabinet, the Conservative Party. It's felt as if there's virtually no organ of the British state that didn't place themselves behind Sue Gray this week, almost as if she were an institution herself. But she's not, and the question must be whether it might be better if there were one dealing with this and not her.
Lewis Goodall there. Well, joining me now is the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen and Chris Philp, who's a Minister at the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And Andrew Bridgen, if I could start with you. Within the last hour, I think, you have called for the Prime Minister to resign. Why now?
Because I think his position has become untenable. The revelations about what's been going on in Number 10 during the lockdown, there's no sign of them ending, and I think they will continue. They're preventing the Prime Minister from functioning as he ought to be and running the country. They're actually preventing the government from functioning as normal, and that's an untenable position.
You were previously a Boris backer. You were a big fan of Boris Johnson. You now talk in your article that you've written, you talk about the fact that this is about him not having a moral compass. Is that how you see it?
He's clearly made huge errors of judgment, and he has not had people around him willing to say to him, this is not the right thing to do. And ultimately, he's the leader of our country. And part of the key elements of leadership is that you don't ask people you're asking to follow you to make sacrifices and suffer privations that you're not willing to bear yourself. And clearly, that has not been the case. That then leaves the Prime Minister morally incapable of having the authority to lead the country. And we're coming out of a pandemic. There may be another emergency in the future. The Prime Minister has to have that moral authority to ask people to make sacrifices. And I don't think Boris Johnson has that any longer.
And the Culture Secretary is one of the people who's come out to support him today. And she said the people who've come out against the Prime Minister, and this is before you came out, are the usual suspects. Are you one of the usual suspects?
No, I supported Boris Johnson's leadership bid. I'm proud I did. The country was in crisis. We were failing to deliver the mandate we've been given by the people at the referendum. Boris Johnson has delivered that. He's seen us through the worst pandemic in our lifetime, but that does not absolve him from the huge errors of judgment he and those around him at Number 10 have made, which has undermined his authority to lead the country and made his position completely untenable, in my view.
How many more of you do you think there are?
I can't speak for other MPs. It's up for all colleagues to look into their own conscience and make their own decisions. What I will say is that when the Prime Minister made his so-called apology, the flow of emails calling for him to go increased in my inbox.
Have you written a letter to Sir Graham Brady?
I have. With a heavy heart, I have written a letter to Sir Graham Brady indicating that I have no confidence in the Prime Minister and calling for a leadership election.
And if Boris Johnson does resign, who do you think should replace him?
This is not the time or the place for that discussion. We need to deal with the matter in hand first. And I really hope the Prime Minister will take this on board from a supporter of his, that now is the time for him to bow out and leave the country with his legacy of Brexit, getting us through the pandemic and the residual goodwill from most of the public.
Andrew Bridgen, thank you very much for coming on. And Chris Philp, what's your reaction to that?
Well, obviously, I'm very disappointed by what I heard just then from Andrew Bridgen. And what I would say to Andrew and other colleagues, and indeed people in the country at large, is that we do need to establish the full facts. That's a matter of, and the public deserve to have a proper investigation with the full facts. I think the individuals concerned, who include long-standing civil servants with not political appointees at all, they deserve to have the full facts properly looked into. And as your piece a moment or two ago said, that is being done by Sue Gray, a senior civil servant with a very high reputation for independence and integrity. So
and yet it appears, sorry to interrupt, but it appears that even as Sue Gray is investigating, it appears that there's another story, Daily Telegraph story today. The night before the Queen sat alone at her own husband's funeral, there were two parties, not one, but two. She sat alone because of your government's rules, and there were two parties allegedly going on in Downing Street, made by the people working in those offices who make those rules. She will have to investigate those too.
Well, I think her remit does allow her to investigate new allegations, if any, come out. I've only just heard those.
What does it say about your government?
I've only just heard those in the last few minutes, as you have. From the reporting I've seen in the last few minutes, I haven't seen any suggestion that the Prime Minister was at those parties or even aware of them. But Sue Gray has I think, the remit to look at those kind of questions. And if she feels it's appropriate, she can answer all of those questions properly rather than reacting off the cuff to partially complete accounts.
Are you expecting more to come out? Are you certain there isn't more to come out? I mean, wouldn't it be better if the Prime Minister just came clean fully about what he knows about what's happening and what's happened?
I think the reason that the Prime Minister initiated this proper investigation by an impartial civil servant with such a high reputation is to make sure all of the facts do come out. And I think all of us, frankly, should, do everyone involved the courtesy and the fairness of waiting for that investigation to be properly and fully carried out and to reach a conclusion before it is.
Bridgen already believes, he's not waiting, he already believes that the Prime Minister's lost the moral authority. You've got Sutton Coldfield, as was reported by Nick Watt tonight. This was a place that, back in the time when the leadership hustings were happening, Boris Johnson went there in 2019, attended a garden party with 400 members of the Sutton Coldfield Conservative constituency, according to Nick Watt. Almost all of them supported him in the leadership hustings, and now, unanimously, they have a vote of no confidence in his leadership. You don't really need to wait, do you?
Well, I think the meeting in Sutton Coldfield, had 10 people attending it. And I would just say, with respect, we do need to establish the full facts. We do need to have due process, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions, however strongly we feel. And I do understand people do feel really strongly about this for the obvious reasons. We've all as a country made enormous sacrifices, been unable to mourn as we would have wished. Loved
it
ones
appears some were making more sacrifices than others, apparently.
And you've talked about the picture of the Queen. So I understand people feel very, very strongly about this. I completely understand that. But we do need to make sure the facts are fully and properly investigated. I mean, Keir Starmer, right, himself, just a couple of weeks ago, said we need to make sure it's properly and fully investigated. That is what is now happening. And I just don't think it's, however angry we feel, or people may feel, we just should let that run its course to make sure we know the facts before drawing conclusions. That's just the right way to do it.
Could I ask, do you see Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, as a lightweight figure, as Jacob Rees-Mogg called him last night on Newsnight?
Well, I don't agree with the position that Douglas has taken on this Prime Minister question. For the reasons I just mentioned, I think we need to wait for the inquiry to play out.
But is he a lightweight figure?
No, I don't think he's a lightweight figure. I think, although I disagree with Douglas on this particular question, I think generally he's been doing a good job leading the Scottish Conservatives. He got, I think, 100,000 more votes in the Holyrood election than even Ruth Davidson got. And he's been holding the SNP to account, who have been doing a terrible job for Scotland's education and health system, despite the fact they get more money. He's been making the case for the union, which we're all better off and safer and stronger in the union. Douglas Ross is respecting the result of that 2014 separation referendum, whereas the nationalists are ignoring the will of the Scottish people expressed in that referendum. So I think Douglas Ross is doing a good job as the leader of the Scottish Conservatives.
Chris Philp, thank you very much for coming on Newsnight tonight. Thank you. Now, earlier today, the Health Secretary announced a shortening of self-isolation as the coronavirus rules start to relax. Somebody who's had COVID but tests negative on day 5 and again on day 6 will be able to re-enter society immediately after that day 6 result. It's part of a drive to, as it's termed, learn to live with COVID. But what does that mean in practice? Will we be able to return to life pre-pandemic, or are working from home, PCR tests and the like here to stay? The Prime Minister cancelled a visit to Lancashire today after a family member tested positive for coronavirus. David Grossman, though, has been there to find out what learning to live with the virus might look like.
The shutters have gone up and the plastic screens between the tables have gone. But the customers have not yet returned to the Townhouse coffee shop in Preston, at least not in the same numbers as before the pandemic.
We're still feeling like we're not getting our usual customers back, our customers that come into the city centre who work here. Obviously they're remote working now or working from home, so we're just not seeing them regular people back in.
The pandemic has demonstrated how interconnected an economy is. For Bernice, many of her missing customers are students at the University of Central Lancashire. They would buy coffee on their way to and from their shiny new campus, but they're still remote learning, at least until next week. But events in Downing Street have made Bernice question whether the hit her business has taken was really necessary.
I feel more like let down and sort of disappointed that we're being put to all these restrictions and we're all abiding by them. And obviously being so far away from London, it just feels like it sometimes just feels a little bit pointless, and it just feels like one rule for one rule for the other, I guess.
As the Omicron wave appears to level off and even decline in parts of the UK, attention is now turning to, quote, learning to live with COVID. But what does that mean? From speaking to public health professionals here in the Northwest, it's clear that learning to live with COVID isn't the same thing as simply returning to the life we all knew before the pandemic hit.
COVID is still a serious threat to public's health. We need to learn to live with COVID, and I place the emphasis on learning to live with COVID. And it doesn't mean that we just give up and just accept the high rates that we're seeing now and mortality. It's about learning to adapt to live with COVID. It's that regular testing, get the jab, protect yourself from serious disease and indeed deaths. If you're symptomatic, please do take your PCR test and stay at home to prevent transmission happening further. If you're not symptomatic, there are not many restrictions.
In the Commons today, the Health Secretary announced an easing of restrictions in England. Isolation for positive cases cut to 5 days, provided someone tests negative twice.
We can be sure that our pharmaceutical defences, vaccines, testing and antivirals
are the best way to protect our health and our freedoms as we learn to live with COVID.
But even though it's now for a shorter period, staff isolating could still significantly disrupt businesses and services. For primary care professionals like Tracy Vell, there's still a lot of learning needed before we can live with the disease.
Well, if we are going to live in a society with COVID, we've got to look at the logistics and learn from some of the issues that we had. So the logistics for PPE, the logistics for testing are really important. Are they freely available? Have we purchased enough of them nationally? Are we making them ourselves? Are we sustainable with that flow of testing? Are we sustainable in the vaccine service? Does the vaccine service make any sense to be delivered by general practice any longer if it's going to be a continuum and it takes them away from their core services?
In Preston, as in the rest of the UK, the memories of this emergency will clearly last. Its icons will take their place with those of previous national struggles. But how much longer until we can truly put this pandemic in the past?
David Grossman. Well, that was a flavour of where we are now in England, but what about further into the future? Joining me is Claire Wenham, Associate Professor of Global Health Policy at the London School of Economics, and entrepreneur and author Luke Johnson. And Luke, if I could start with you, welcome to the programme. What does living with COVID look like to you? I mean, do you see your businesses going back, for example, to what they were like before 2020?
I sincerely hope so. I'm optimistic, and I think that in time people will realise that we cannot allow the hysteria to continue, that if we are to be able to, for example, afford to fund the NHS, then we need to economically recover. And that means we need to get back to work, we need to be back in cities, people need to be in offices, we need to recover our productivity, and we simply cannot afford more lockdowns.
Claire Wenham, for you, what does learning to live with COVID look like? It cannot allow the hysteria to continue, says Luke Johnson.
I think we've got a lot of evidence now and a lot of tools at our disposal that we didn't have, 18 months ago. We know, for example, that masks are a very effective way at stopping the spread of the disease. And we know there's, particularly N95 masks are a lot more effective than cloth masks. Today, for example, the Biden administration came out and said they were going to make sure that every American could get free access to these masks. So could that be something we could do? We then need to think about making sure that people are being vaccinated and that we're putting in this kind of simple measures that don't impact on the economy in the same way and allow.
But do you think people are going to have, sorry to interrupt, but do you think that people are going to have to be vaccinated every 6 months? I mean, in a sense, is it sustainable to have a vaccine system where you have to end up being vaccinated every 6 months or so?
Well, I think in the ideal world with future generations of vaccines, they might be able to make a pan-coronavirus vaccine, which might be able to protect against future variants, and therefore you wouldn't need that. We're not at that stage. At this moment, we need to, to keep doing what we are doing. But actually, when it comes to vaccination, the most important thing I think we could be doing is making sure we can get vaccines to everybody around the world. We know that this pandemic isn't going to end until it ends globally. It won't suddenly just end in British borders alone.
Right.
And to do that, we need to make sure that we can, rapidly expand capacity for domestic production of vaccines and getting those made. And that requires the UK government, amongst other governments, waiving intellectual property rights on that area.
We've had a lot of arguments about that on the programme. Luke Johnson, I just want to keep it to here for now, which is, for you and your business, if this continues and, people have to self-isolate and you end up having more staff off sick than you would in normal times, it makes a lot of businesses that are on the edge now unviable, doesn't it, looking into the future?
It does, and it's especially frustrating when you say off sick, because the vast majority, particularly at the moment, are not sick. They've tested positive, but they're completely asymptomatic. And, it is a ludicrous waste of human resources. As I say, it's unaffordable.
So what does that mean? What does that mean we should be doing?
I think we need to steadily cut the restrictions and recognise that this is a disease that is not a threat to the vast majority of people, and that society has already, I think, started to change the narrative, because I think a majority of people are now no longer in favour of continued restrictions. We've got very high levels of vaccination in this country, and I think we have to get back to real life.
Getting back to real life, though, Claire Wenham, I mean, do you accept that people are, you know, we were very scared at the beginning. People don't seem to be as scared. There's a higher appetite for risk now?
Absolutely, and I completely understand, you know, frustrations and people wanting to go back to life, you know, as it were in 2019. However, you know, just because some people might be asymptomatic, it doesn't mean that this virus won't lead to serious outcomes in some populations, in the unvaccinated population, for example. And we also know, we don't know the effects of long COVID, and we're seeing things such as increased rates of childhood diabetes linked to COVID. And so I'm not suggesting we should put any restrictions on, or as minimal restrictions as possible. What I'm suggesting is there are simple measures which don't restrict economic activities, such as mask wearing, which will protect people and protect those most vulnerable in our society.
And Luke Johnson, I mean, Morrison's Next, IKEA, they've all come out recently and said they're not going to pay sick pay to unvaccinated staff who are exposed to COVID and then have to take time off, differently from if they actually have COVID. Would you consider your businesses going down that route?
No, because I think it's discriminatory. I think it's coercive. I think it's effectively blackmail. And I think for a personal medical procedure, an employer should not be using such tactics.
But sorry to interrupt, but it's not discriminatory, is it, if everyone has access to the vaccine, everyone has access to the booster, as they do here in the UK?
Yes, but we know that for various cultural reasons, certain communities in society have lower levels of vaccination. I support vaccination, I'm vaccinated, and I encourage people to get vaccinated. But I think these sort of coercive measures actually don't work, and they are discriminatory, and I think it's unethical, and I don't think they should be doing it.
I think I'm going to have to wrap it up there. I'm sorry to say that we're reaching the end of the programme. Claire Wenham, Luke Johnson, thank you so much for coming on. Just a few moments to take a look at some of the front pages. We already showed you the Telegraph, but there are, of course, others out today. The Daily Mail says it has that haunted look of Duke as he arrives for Crisis Summit with the Queen. And as we know what happened after that, he was stripped, as they put it, of his military titles, agreed not to use HRH. The Guardian leads with the same story. The Queen strips Andrew of military and royal roles. And The Times, Andrew humiliated as the Queen strips his titles. And there he is standing on the balcony with the Queen, as we saw earlier. But of course, Downing Street parties were not criminal, inquiry to say. That is to The Times. We will see what happens with that Sue Gray inquiry when it comes out. That is all from us tonight. Faisal is here tomorrow, but until then, good night.